Good afternoon, everyone. I thank you so much for your patience with us getting started. We are here to talk about student-centered Tier 2 interventions with Dr. Ty Collins, who is joining us from the University of Cincinnati, where he is an associate professor of school psychology. There is a link in the chat to our Padlet, and that does contain today's presentation. Please keep the link for the chat. If Dr. Collins refers to a resource or a website, we will update the Padlet with that information. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Collins.
Thank you. Thanks, Shonda. Thanks to Patton for the invitation here. And apologies to everyone. We had a miscommunication around the time. I was in Central Time rather than Eastern Time. So apologies for that. And thank you all for sticking around. So we'll definitely make the most of the time that we have together here. As Shonda said, I'll be talking about implementing effective student-centered Tier 2 interventions. So I'll tell you a bit about myself and kind of how I got into this work, and then we'll kind of dive into different types of Tier 2 interventions, as well as how we talk about Tier 2 interventions and how we view them from a kind of a culturally responsive lens. So I invite you to use the chat throughout our conversation, chat with each other. I'll be checking the chat as well. I also have Poll Everywhere polls for us to kind of connect with each other, and sometimes where I'll be asking some questions and ask folks to be putting information in Poll Everywhere as well. So we'll have these opportunities to connect with each other. At the end as well, we'll have some time for questions and answers and any troubleshooting. So I want us to use this time together to answer any questions you all have about intervention implementation, how to do it well, what's working in your schools, what's not working as well. All right. So to get us going here, I want to tell you a bit about myself. So I am from New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm a product of a single mother in New Orleans. I went to Loyola University, New Orleans for undergrad, and I started, like many psychology majors, I started as a bio pre-med major, so I wanted to be a medical doctor. And Hurricane Katrina happened during my sophomore year, actually the day that my sophomore year was supposed to start. And so that makes you rethink everything about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so in the spring of 2006, when I came back to undergrad at Loyola, we started a mentoring program in schools. And so I got really interested in supporting the students in schools, many of whom look like me. And so we really talked with them a lot about their academic achievement and how they navigated the school environment and all those different pieces. And how, one of the big things that came out of those conversations was that they were really supporting each other. So oftentimes, especially if they had a teacher or a school staff who didn't share their racial ethnic identity, they really were working with each other and helping each other get through the day and helping each other, support each other throughout that process. And so I really got interested in who creates safe spaces for students in schools and who supports teachers and other school staff in creating and maintaining those positive and safe spaces, right? So we know there are some teachers who have great relationships with their students, and students, will do amazing things and really thrive in those environments. We have some environments where students aren't really thriving in, and that they're being suspended, and especially Black and Brown students are being suspended and placed in special education at higher rates. And so who helps with all those things, and who kind of creates a better and safer environment for Black and Brown students? And so I kind of stumbled into school psychology that way. So I switched my major to psychology and kind of was full force ahead in the world of school psychology. So I went to LSU for my PhD in school psychology, and while at LSU, really looked at a lot of MTSS and a lot of PBIS work. So, LSU is a very behavioral program and really focused on what we called RTI back in the day, and that, now MTSS and PBIS kind of stuff. And so as we were talking about things like check in, check out, and other types of interventions, we started to think about why do they have to meet with an adult? Why can't they meet with a peer, right? So thinking back to those conversations that I had with students in New Orleans when I was doing mentoring, and about how they really supported each other, I really got interested in how can we kind of be systematic about empowering students to help each other through the school process and helping them be the interventionists in schools. And so got really into peer-mediated interventions and really the cultural relevance of those types of interventions. And so I've done quite a bit of work in that area, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we cover Tier 2 peer-mediated interventions. So I got my PhD from LSU. I did my internship at Fort Worth Independent School District. My dissertation was on peer-mediated check-in, check-out, and so we'll talk a bit about that when we get there later in the presentation as well. And then I started my faculty career at the University of Cincinnati. So I was a faculty member in the school psychology program for 10 years, the last 3 years of which I coordinated the program through the pandemic, which was a perfect time to start coordinating the program and doing all those pieces. But yeah, that was a great experience. And then this summer, I actually transitioned to an administrative role within the university where I'm now Associate Dean of our graduate college. So I'm focused on graduate policy and graduate curriculum at the university level and kind of taking everything I know about systems change and behavioral interventions and all the pieces and really applying that to the university level at large. So I'm now Associate Dean in the grad college as well as an Associate Professor in school psychology. So still involved in research and still writing and doing those pieces as well. So that's a bit about me and my background, how I kind of got here and kind of the how I kind of built this expertise in peer-mediated intervention specifically, but also thinking about how we better support Black students in schools more broadly. So that's a bit about me and my background. My research agenda, as I shared, is about interventions for Black students in urban schools. I'm a BCBA, so I definitely do behavioral interventions, group contingencies, peer-mediated interventions, those types of things in schools. So really focusing on being efficient with the limited resources we have in schools, right? We don't have a billion staff in every building who can do all the things, right? We have limited number of people in our buildings, but we have lots of students, right? So what are the interventions that we can have students kind of take a larger part in, show some leadership in, and supporting each other in schools? And so really focusing on that kind of the cultural relevance of those types of interventions for Black youth in schools. And then more broadly thinking about social justice in the field of school psychology, how we're training school psychologists and other staff and other educational staff in terms of teachers and social workers and others to be culturally relevant, to engage in culturally relevant practice and really be change makers in terms of changing our systems to better support the children and families we're serving. And so really thinking about how we're preparing our students in graduate programs broadly, what we do around recruitment and retention of racially and ethically minoritized graduate students within our programs. So I'd love for everyone, if you could, to place an emoji in the chat based on how you're feeling in the current moment. So what emoji would best represent how you're feeling in this moment? If you could place that in the chat. All right, seeing some smiling faces. That's awesome. Good to see. Good to see. We've been getting some direct messages of smiling faces, so that's awesome. Cool, cool. All right. Great, great. All right, thank you. Cool. Folks are feeling good, doing well. Cool. Good to see. Good to see. I got some sleepy folks as well. Awesome, awesome. Okay, yeah, I'm seeing some of the direct messages versus being able to chat with everyone to totally understand. All right, good, 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 good. All right, thank you, everyone. You can keep throwing those in the chat as well. All right, moving into some goals for our session today. We'll talk about the language that we use when we talk about Tier 2 interventions and MTSS broadly. So I want to make sure that we are all on the same page about using language that isn't so deficit focused in terms of our students, and really thinking about system-centered language while doing student-centered interventions. And so how do we center our students? How do we make sure that our interventions are culturally relevant and are supportive to the children and families we're serving? And then we'll kind of highlight a few really common, very well used tier 2 interventions. So we'll talk about check in, check out. We'll talk about self-management interventions and kind of that whole world of different components. And then we'll end on peer-mediated interventions, which I'm slightly biased with, but what I want to kind of share with you all is really that throughout the presentation today, I really want to have us thinking about components of interventions, right? I think so often we try to find like what is the intervention for this population, or what is the manualized treatment, or what is the quick fix, right, that I can use that.
So it looks like Dr. Collins is having some internet difficulties. We will see if he is able
All right,
to.
apologies, folks. All right. So if we think about who students are and all the variety of identities that folks bring to the table, variety of experiences that people bring to the table, we really need to be thinking about intervention in terms of components that we're going to put together for the specific situation and for the specific student to create and kind of build an intervention for this specific situation. And so you'll see a lot about flexibility with check in, check out, with self-management, with peer-mediated interventions, where we can really think about all these different components that we can put together to make the best intervention possible. So typical tier 2 language, right? We are MTSS folks and kind of PBIS folks, and really kind of anti the labeling and kind of the deficit oriented views of students, right? But when we look at tier 2 language, we oftentimes see quite a bit of deficit language. We say students need more support, right? Or that they didn't respond to tier 1, or that they didn't respond to the intervention, or that they're at risk, right? And so it's interesting. Very often we are in education, we are pretty obsessed with calling students wrong or calling families broken in some way, right? And so we kind of perpetuate this language and this this language around kind of deficits of students, and that they did not respond to what we did for them, right? Or that they need more than we are offering them, right? And so I really want us to kind of rethink and kind of critically evaluate the language that we're using when we're talking about our children and our families, and really kind of use more system-centered language. So the idea there is if we have students whose behavior or whose reading or whose math is not responding to tier 1, that means we need to put more resources into our system to make it an equitable system that's going to reach everyone. So switching from a language of they need more to we need to do more, right? So going from they are at risk to we are at risk of losing them, right? And so switching our language to be more systems focused so that we can then see the strengths of our students and capitalize on their strengths to best support them, right? So typical tier 2 language says they need more, they're at risk, they didn't respond to what we did. I would love for us to shift our thinking as well as our communication to say, not that we implement tier 2 for the 20% or more of kids who don't respond to tier 1, but for whom tier 1 was not successful, right? Tier 1 was not enough to support them, right? And so we need to infuse more resources into our system to better support the students, right? Rather than they are wrong in some way and they did not respond to tier one, right? So it's a shift in our thinking, shift in our communication. So I really love for us to go back into our variety of settings and really kind of challenge some folks when they use that deficit-oriented language. It really can communicate a blaming of students and families for not responding to an intervention or for not following the rules and all those types of things when we're really here to serve the students. And so really thinking about switching our language, I think will be really helpful. Our systems are imperfect, right? None of us are in perfectly resourced schools that have everything that we need and that allow us to do everything for every student, right? We have imperfect systems, and so it's important for us to really acknowledge those and really say that we need to infuse more resources into our systems to achieve equity across the board. So I'd like to hear what are some examples of negative language about students and families that you might hear in your schools, and then what do we do about that? How do we address that, especially when we're thinking about tier two interventions in schools? So I have a poll everywhere poll. So if you could go to pollev.com/TAI Collins 116 and respond to this poll, that would be amazing. So what are some examples of negative language you've heard about children and families in your schools? Sorry, so we're seeing this word cloud with lots of words around student doesn't care, family doesn't care, lazy, dysfunctional, students are struggling. I see things like ghetto, rough, um, and expectations, the environment, right? So we're seeing all of this language that we really are perpetuating within our schools and our buildings and really wanting us to really be those change agents that are really going to go into our schools and really challenge some of those negative comments that we're hearing about our students and really challenge how folks are really thinking about the students and families we're serving and how they are supposed to be there to support and to provide opportunities and to help students grow and thrive. But even within our intervention MTSS language that's supposed to be about improving student skills and supporting them in growing and achieving, right? We can still perpetuate this language. So I really want us to be aware of the language that folks are using in schools and aware of the language that we're using and making sure that we're using kind of positive student-centered language. And if we're going to blame anyone, let's talk about the systems that we have in place and really kind of critically evaluate what we're doing in our schools to best serve our students. All right, thank you all for your participation there. So thinking about student-centered interventions, right? Student-centered interventions are first going to be personalized to the students we're working with, right? So it can be as simple as if they love Spider-Man, let's slap a Spider-Man sticker on their behavioral report card or on their direct behavior rating form, right? It could be the language that we use. It could be who's implementing the intervention. It could be involving them in developing the intervention and coming up with the goals. And so we'll talk about self-monitoring and those pieces as well. So it's going to be personalized to the students. It's going to be strengths-based, right? It's going to be looking at each student individually and the unique strengths that they bring to the table and thinking about how we can best capitalize on those strengths, right? So we can all think of a student who might be have super attention maintained problem behavior, right? Where they're just kind of the class clown, or they're just doing stuff so that the world stops and everybody's focused on them, right? To me, that means that they really value attention. They really value connections with other people, right? So can we switch that for them to be a student leader? Can we switch that for them to be earning additional time to work with other peers on different projects and different things, right? Can we switch it so that we're using the strengths that they have, which is that they're really social and really value social connection and communication in a way that can now better serve them in terms of navigating the school environment, right? So really thinking about the strengths of our students. The student-centered intervention should also be culturally affirming, right? And culturally relevant. It should be based on the values and cultures of the students and families we're working with. It should be empowering. Students should have some agency and some voice in what's happening with their educational experience and their educational journey within their schools. It should be evidence-based. It should be using research that will guide what's happening in practice, as well as the opposite. Practice should be guiding what's going on in research as well, but thinking about the various components that we know to be evidence-based and kind of putting those components together, as I shared earlier, to develop a really strong intervention. It should also be implemented with fidelity, right? So we talk a lot about treatment integrity and intervention adherence and all those pieces. They really need to be making sure that we're implementing interventions well and that we're monitoring how well interventions are implemented. I think where we need to go in terms of implementation science is, are people receiving that intervention in the way that we expect them to, right? So we could have a teacher and a student, for example. Let's say they have a pretty rough teacher-student relationship. They're not really getting along. Student doesn't trust the teacher. Teacher may have low expectations of student, et cetera. And we implement some intervention where the teacher is going to now be increasing their rates of praise with the student, right? The question is that happening in a way that a student's going to receive it? Does the student trust it? Does the student believe it? Does the student really think that this is a good intervention? Is this working for the student? So we could say, in terms of a treatment integrity or fidelity perspective, yes, we have increased our rates of praise, but is that received as praise from the student, right? So really thinking kind of long-term about where that kind of work, I think, should really be going in terms of treatment receipt. How are people receiving the interventions that we're putting into place? And finally, that intervention should be co-created. We should be involving the family, we should be involving community, we should be involving students in developing and implementing these interventions so that we have more communication between home and school, so that students have more agency and more voice in deciding what's going on in their interventions and deciding what's going on in their education. And they also kind of are empowered and have more agency and more engagement with the intervention, and they're kind of more a part of it, right? I always talk about, if you were to go to a nutritionist and they were to just give you this plan of things to eat and things to not eat, right? And not ask you what you like, what you don't like, what you're allergic to, right? And, they have a bunch of tomatoes on there, but you can't eat tomatoes. Then, how likely are you to follow that plan? How likely are you going to implement that intervention in your own life and improve your nutrition, right? If it's not personalized to you and who you are and what you like and what you don't like, right? And so I think we have to, again, think beyond the kind of manualized, this is exactly what they did in the research study type thing, and really think about, personalizing interventions to best support students. So one thing I do want to kind of share broadly is that we can't really intervene our way out of systemic issues, right? And so there is no good behavior game for sexism in schools. There is no check in, check out for racism, right? And so we really have to make sure that tier 1 is as strong as possible. Before we can get to tier 2 and move forward, I really think about it in terms of tier 0, right? Our policies, our practices, our systems in schools. Do we have student-centered policies? Do we have tier one systems that really support students, where they see themselves in their curriculum, where they have teachers and other staff in buildings who they trust, who they see themselves in, who they feel are supportive. Do they have a community of students and peers who they can go to if they need help, right? These things are a requirement for us to be successful at all at tier two, tier three, and beyond, right? It's really important that our systems are positive and supportive, and are received as positive and supportive by our students and by our families. So we want to make sure that, as we're talking about culturally relevant intervention and tier two and all these pieces, that we're really thinking about our systems, making sure that our systems are positive and supportive and valuable and seen as affirming and supportive for our students. So I really want us to really thinking about ourselves as social justice advocates, right? We really should be implementing these interventions and really kind of creating systems that ensure that our students have educational rights and opportunities, right? That we're looking across areas of difference, across race and gender and ability and all the different identities, and really looking at who our policies and practices are serving and who they're not serving. And making sure that we're empowering those who have traditionally been left out or marginalized or minoritized. So it's important to think about, what we're doing each individually in our systems, in our buildings, to really address these isms, right? Racism, sexism, all the other ableism, right? All the other isms that can exist and that can be produced and kind of perpetuated in our school systems, that we're making sure that we are advocates to change our systems to make them more positive and more affirming for all of our students. And so really thinking about making everything that we're doing culturally relevant, that we are looking at strengths, that we're looking at affirming and positive things that allows us to best support our students. And so it requires quite a few things from us in terms of acknowledging what is working and what's not working in our system, and being intentional about creating change and being bold enough to go into our systems and really do the work of creating change and making more positive and more affirming environments. It requires us to be humble in terms of receiving feedback from folks about our own behavior, about our systems, and really thinking about, as we are implementing any intervention or putting anything in place, that we're thinking about who is benefiting, who's being left out, who might be marginalized or oppressed by this, and really thinking about changing our policies and practices to be more just and more appropriate across the board. I really, whenever I talk about intervention, I like to bring up this quote, which is an African proverb that says, "A child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth." And this is a picture of Killmonger from my favorite movie, Black Panther, and he burned down the village, absolutely. And so it's important that we think about embracing our children, right? And the important piece, I think, of this quote, it says that the child who is not embraced by the village, right? It didn't say the child who doesn't follow the rules of the village, right? It says embraced by the village. So we, as the adults in the building, are the village who really need to wrap our arms around these kids, support them, and help kind of guide them and allow them to thrive more, because if not, then they will burn the village down to feel its warmth. So it's really important for us to be thinking about what we're putting in place to best support and guide and support our children. So before we intervene, before we get into what the intervention looks like and how often it's going to be implemented and what the rewards are and on all those pieces, we need to be asking some questions like, is our school a positive, safe environment, right? Is our tier 0, as I think about it, or tier 1, supportive? Is it positive? Are we looking at this behavior the way that we should, right? One of the things I often think about and kind of talk with my students about is how we view academic behaviors versus how we view behaviors, or like problem behavior in that case, right? Oftentimes with academics, if it's an error, a teacher will really address that and really kind of take it personally in terms of, I haven't reached them yet, I need to keep teaching, and we're going to get there, got to keep teaching and make sure that they get this multiplication thing, right? Whereas on the behavioral side of things, a teacher might take it personally and say, they're disrespecting me, they're lazy, they don't like me, I don't like them, right? And so there oftentimes isn't that I haven't reached them yet, let me make sure I work on that relationship. Let me make sure I reteach expectations because I'm going to reach them, but I just haven't gotten it yet, right? So we talk about academic errors, but we talk about behavior problems, right? So we look at things very differently. And so it's interesting to even think about from an academic versus behavioral perspective, are we viewing these errors, behavioral errors, as errors, or are we viewing them as problems, and who are they problems for, right? Also, if this were a different student with a different identity, would we view this behavior similarly, right? If this is a Black girl and we feel like she's being sassy or being disrespectful, right? If this were an Asian girl doing the same thing, would we have responded differently, right? Would we look at it differently, right? And those are some tough questions to ask, but they're so important to ask because this is what our students are experiencing, right? They are experiencing issues where they know that if they look different or if they showed up with a different identity, that they would be treated very differently in their school. So it's on us to really ask those questions and make sure that we and our staff are viewing this behavior and viewing these things as appropriately as possible. Thinking about what dynamics could be at play. Is there any bias happening here? Is there any privilege going on here? What do our routines look like? Are we actually supporting student success? Are we serving students? Are we expecting them to serve us, right? And so really thinking about all these pieces at that, again, tier 0 level that we really need to think about. Also, what's happening in the world? Our students are aware. They watch the news. They are on the social media. They know what's going on in the world. They know what's happening, around them, in the city or in the state or in the country, et cetera. And so, really thinking about what factors are at play here. Are there things happening in the world that are affecting how our students are showing up in the building, how our staff are showing up in the building, right? And are those some things we need to be discussing and thinking about in terms of how we're interacting with each other, and are they affecting our relationships in the building? So thinking about, again, before we get into the cooler intervention and what things we're going to put into place, what is our base level foundation for a positive and safe environment, and what does that look like, and is it actually supportive of student success? But finally, I'm really kind of, again, foundational stuff here. I want to think about the forest and the trees. So this idea of intersectionality. So Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term, and it's really about the variety of identities that we all share and we all have that make up who we are, and that allow us to experience a variety of different forms of discrimination and privilege, right? So, excuse me for a second. So thinking about your race, your gender, your marital status, your physical ability, disability, all the different types of identities that make up who we are, right? They all intersect in various ways, and they intersect with the various systems that we engage in to produce discrimination, privilege, and all those things. And so Hayes and Tormino talked about kind of intervention work in the mid 90s, and really talked about this idea of the new prejudice, which would be treating everyone in one group as the same, right? So before, we think about prejudice as, oh, we think everybody's the same, everybody has the exact same experiences. What they were kind of arguing for in the mid 90s was this new form of prejudice, which is all Black people feel the same way about this, or all Asian people have the same experience, right? So it's really thinking about, kind of the way I describe it, as the forest and the trees, right? That there are forest level factors that affect various communities of people, but that each individual person is one individual tree that's at different parts of the forest, and that have different experiences, different values, different things that they're bringing to the table, and no two trees look the same, right? So thinking about, as we're implementing and as we're developing interventions, that there is not going to be a Black boy 8th grade intervention. Like, that does not exist, and it will never exist, right? We have to create the intervention that works for this specific student. And so we have to think about the factors that are at play at the forest level. We have to think about racism. We have to think about issues of privilege and bias, and all the pieces that could be at play. but also think about the individual student, the individual tree here, and what experiences they're having, and how we can best support them as an individual, right? So really thinking about the intersectional identities that we all bring to the table, and again, fashioning an intervention that supports and works specifically for individual students. So what does this all mean kind of in terms of a foundational level? There's not going to be a magic intervention for specific populations. There is no high school American Indian intervention. It just doesn't exist. So we have to think about how we create interventions and create these components that we put together to make the best intervention for individual students to best support them. Okay? So we're going to create these components, we're going to implement them, and then we're going to adapt them to best fit the environment that we're working in. So culturally relevant MTSS should really be about being positive and proactive, really thinking about the opportunity gaps that exist within our buildings and really closing those with effective and culturally relevant interventions, okay? Thinking about our policies, our practices in our building, thinking about the bias that could be existing within our building. There is really good work out of University of Oregon on what's called vulnerable decision points. So the idea that if, for example, a teacher or a staff member is really tired or hasn't had lunch yet or has these different kind of emotional states that could affect how they respond to a behavior or how they implement something, or whether they're likely to send a student to the office or do something else to try to de-escalate a situation or whatever, right? So really thinking about interventions and practices that we can provide to support teachers in changing how they might respond to something. So thinking about, looking at a teacher, looking at the data and saying, okay, well, right before lunch, it looks like we're having lots of issues in this classroom, right? So not necessarily thinking that it might be a student issue, but it might be on the staff side, right? Where, we're getting close to lunch, let's support teacher in maybe getting a snack before we get there, and also thinking about what kind of exercises or what interventions or what supports we can put in place for the teacher to make some different decisions close to lunchtime, for example. So thinking about equity in everything that we're doing, making sure that we're assessing appropriately and looking at strengths when we're implementing interventions. And then finally, thinking about relationships, right? All about relationships between students and teachers, relationships between students and other staff in the building, between students and each other, as well as with the community and the families who we're serving. So another poll for us. How can we invite families and the community to participate in school, right? So I'm gonna put this poll up. We know that in many communities, in many various identities, that folks have had negative experiences with school in the past and with education broadly, right? So really rethinking what can we really do to encourage families and the communities to be engaged in school, and how can we build trust with the folks who we're here to serve? I'm so sorry.
Dr. Collins, can you pull up the poll a little bit more? The bottom of it is cut off.
Let me see here. All right, may have this better.
Oh, we're seeing the presenter view.
I see. Yeah, I don't know how to switch that. I'll go back to. Yeah, I don't know why it's doing that part. I'll
You'll
sure.
summarize it for us. It'll be fine.
Sure, yeah, sorry about that. So think about the times that they're available. Absolutely, having communities, family fun nights, inviting them in and sharing positive things and not just negative things about what's going on in the building. Yes, give them snacks. Yes, food is always helpful. Family nights at schools, weekly newsletter, social media, having volunteers, invited them into the school, absolutely. Parent panel, great idea, love that. Sending positive notes home, absolutely. For so many folks, The only time they hear from the school is when there's something bad happening, when the student has been suspended or there's some medical issue, right? They oftentimes don't just get the communication as much as would be helpful. So absolutely, I'm seeing a lot about increased communication and positive communication, consistent communication with families. Yes, absolutely. Highlight their child's work, their strengths. Absolutely, love that. Absolutely. Not just when something is wrong. Absolutely. Great, great, great. Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone. Cool. All right, so we're gonna start in terms of interventions. We'll start with check and check out. I did build in a break after this one, so we can take a break as well when we get there. So starting with check and check out, it's very, very pretty famous tier 2 intervention that's pretty widely used. I would argue probably too widely used, and really need to be thinking about making some changes to it and implementing some different components within check and check out to make it most effective for individual students. But really awesome intervention, very much evidence-based, and can really be adapted to do quite a few different things here. So with check and check out, you may have heard it as a behavior education plan or check and connect. Check, connect, and expect. There's lots of different ways that it's really that's really kind of referred to. But overall, the intervention involves mentoring with some goal setting, some feedback, and some rewards. So what it looks like is there is a check-in at the beginning of the day, typically, usually 3 to 5 minutes, really brief, where the student meets with their mentor. Traditionally, it is an adult mentor. I will kind of share more a little bit later about how that mentor can be a peer. But the student meets with the mentor at the beginning of the day, does a check-in where it's, again, 3 to 5 minutes. We talk about our behaviors for the day. We might have 3 or 5 target behaviors, and we'll have a goal that we want to meet for that day. So we might have 20 possible points, and our goal might be to get 15 out of 20 points on our behavior rating form during the day. So we check in the morning. Hey, let's have a great day. Here's your behavior rating form. Here are your goals. Make sure these are the behaviors that we're expecting to see from you. Have a great day. I know you can do it, right? And then we move on. We allow the student to go through the day. There's feedback during the day. In the beginning of the intervention, when it was first implemented, it was a lot of like after every hour, the teacher gave feedback, right? There was some studies that showed you don't need to do that every single hour after every single session. So there's some type of teacher feedback, praise, support throughout the day. At the end of the day, the teacher completes the form that says how many points the student got that day based on their behavior, based on the behavioral goals that we wanted to see. Then there's a checkout at the end of the day. They meet again with their mentor. We talk about how today went. If they got the goal, awesome. We get the reward. Typically, it's a reward that the student has chosen. If they didn't get the goal, we say, okay, we didn't get it today, but let's try again tomorrow. Let's talk about how we can do better tomorrow, get more points tomorrow, and meet our goals tomorrow, right? The mentor is always in a positive, encouraging role. It's never an evaluative role. It's never a disciplinarian type role. It's always what we call unconditional positive regard. So that there's like at least one person in the building that no matter what happens, that student can go to and know that they can get a positive kind of encouraging word from. So even when it doesn't go so well, in terms of getting the points for the behavior, we can really kind of encourage and support toward getting a better goal the following day. And then at the end, the rating form is sent home. There's usually a note within the form where you can write a note to say, how the day went or whatever. And then the family gets it. They can sign it and return it the next day at check-in, right? So this is the basic components of check-in, check-out. Check-in at the beginning of the day. Teacher rates behavior during the day. There's a checkout, and then the home component. The great thing about this intervention, of course, it's been widely researched, lots of interventions, lots of support. There's so many ways that you can alter this to use the flexibility of it to really support the students that you want to support. So, for example, the rating form, right? We could have students develop their own goals, write their own behaviors that they want to see themselves improve in, right? We could have behaviors related to internalizing stuff. Like I did one of these studies where we did check and check out for depression type behaviors or behaviors related to depression or anxiety type stuff. We can do it for social skills and for other types of behaviors, right? So it was originally developed around disruptive behavior, out of seat, maybe more kind of combative or oppositional types of behaviors, where you can really think about the types of behaviors that we use, the types of form, the frequency of feedback, and we can really kind of take this structure and really add to it and change it to best meet the needs of the students we're serving. So why does it work? We're getting lots of feedback on our behavior, right? Where we have clear goals and we have rewards around those goals. So we know at the beginning of the day, the student knows how many points they need to get to be successful that day, right? They know exactly what behaviors the teacher is looking for and what they'll be monitoring them on. We have this unconditional positive regard in this kind of mentoring component where there is a person they can go to for support and that this person is not going to be evaluative. So in some cases, check and check out is implemented with a teacher being the mentor, but that doesn't have to be the case. And so you can have, and it's often best to have a separate person who can be the mentor for the student. So it could be a PE teacher or a football coach or the school psych or the principal or librarian, right? Anyone else kind of in the building who can really be a positive role model for that student and really provide that positive regard. And I would also argue we have lots of students who could also be trained to be mentors and be interventionists within this intervention. There's also this idea of what we call pre-correction in the behavioral world. So we're discussing the behavioral expectations and we're discussing them early. So during that check-in, we're saying, your goals for today are to be respectful, to be responsible, to be a student leader, right? So what does that mean? What behaviors are included in that? What's not included in that, right? We're being clear about our behavioral expectations at the beginning of the day. And so students know what they're being expected to do throughout the day. And then finally, that home communication piece where we are involving the family, we're involving increased communication between the school and home. And hopefully on those positive days when things go well and the students are getting those awards, that they would see that happening at home, that at home they know what's going on when it's going positively, when the intervention's going well. And there might be some cool stuff happening for them at home as well when the intervention goes well in schools. So when we're implementing check and check out, it's important that we set attainable goals, especially at the beginning. So if it's a 20 points, what we want to do is look at how many points would they be getting before we implement the intervention. So it's a good idea maybe for like a week to have the teacher filling out the form without the intervention in place, kind of as a baseline to see how many points would they typically get. So we might be at like 4 points out of 20, right? And so then I wouldn't set our goal at 15 points immediately, right? Maybe our goal starts at 8 points and then we gradually increase the goal, right? So we want to make sure we're building what we call behavioral momentum. So we want to make sure they're getting the goal, that they're really working hard for it. And so they really need to see it as something that's attainable and that they can get. So I really want to set really good goals that the teacher is okay with and that the teacher is okay with them getting rewarded for, but that allows us to kind of build toward the final goals that we really want to see. Co-creating those expectations with students could be really helpful. So sitting down and meeting with the student to say, how are you doing in school? What's helping you in school? What's not helping you in school? It seems like we're having some trouble with paying attention in class. So what do you want to see? Like, do you want to see yourself doing better in class, and what does that look like for you? And so the students can come up with their ideas for the behaviors that they want to see on their behavioral report card. They could design their behavior report card. They could come up with, what it looks like and what would be best for them, right? And then they have so much kind of engagement with this intervention and that they're really into it because they have designed it. They've helped to support what it looks like, and then now they can kind of receive it in a better situation. So allowing us to really giving the students the agency to implement these interventions. Again, the unconditional positive regard piece, that mentor, that coach really should not have an evaluative role. They should not be the person giving the points, right? In most situations, it should be kind of separate people where the mentor is that unconditional positive regard type person. Again, have the student think about, can the student select who's the adult or the peer who they want to work with? Can the student select what the rewards are, what the goals are, right? And allow them again to have that agency. That rating form again is flexible, so you can do social skills, you can do depression type behaviors, you can do anxiety stuff, you can do lots of different things in terms of joining ongoing groups or following directions or completing work, right? It could be based on academic stuff. So it could be during independent seat work where there's a certain number of math problems that we want them to complete, right? It could be based on those types of things. It doesn't have to just be based on disruptive behavior. And again, as I'll say throughout our time together, combining with other interventions like social skills. So you could have a student who is experiencing kind of social skills training or social skills groups interventions, and then also using the behaviors that you're learning in that group on their rating form. So now it's kind of increasing the cohesion between what they're learning in their social skills group and then what they're being evaluated on in terms of their behavior throughout the classroom. And we can, again, the other piece is that check and check out is not the answer for everything, right? So the traditional check and check out is really great for disruptive behavior and really great for behavior that's maintained by attention, so, or access to kind of rewards, right? So if you think about behaviors where the student is really motivated by an adult attention, or in the case of peer mediated check in, check out, motivated by peer attention, that would be great for this, right? Because they're getting that mentorship, they're getting the rewards. If they're motivated by those things, that's awesome. But if they're not, right? If they're not motivated by those things and they're more motivated by getting out of math, or what we would call escape, right? Getting out of math work or not being in the building or not being near their peers or whatever, those types of things, this would not be the best type of intervention for it, right? So we really need to think of how we can use this structure again to best support a different type of intervention that would better support those types of behaviors. So for example, at the bottom here, I have like escape-based support. So if the behavior is something where it's not that they want attention, but that they want to not do math, they would really need to be thinking about, okay, yes, we can implement check in, check out, but the traditional way that we would do it would not address any of those issues. And so we really need to think about the difficulty of the task, right? Is the task that we're asking them to do appropriate and at the appropriate level for them to be successful? Do we need to be changing that task, right? There could be some self-monitoring in there, as I shared before, around work completion. So do we need to add some self-monitoring points in there, which we'll talk about during the next section here? Is there a break routine that we could build into it? So do they get a certain number of break cards at the beginning of the day, and they have X number that they can use throughout the day? And then at the end of the day, part of their evaluation is how many break cards do they have left, right? And we could slowly increase the criterion for how many break cards they have, and really kind of incorporate that in terms of the rewards that they have, right? So really thinking about this kind of check in, check out structure as a really great structure, but the typical intervention is really great for specific types of behavior. So thinking about other supports that we could add into check in, check out to make it best and more personalized to the individual student. So we could, change where they're seated in the classroom. We could add a peer either as the mentor or as a buddy in check in, check out. So they could be a peer coach. So you could have the student meet with their adult, let's say the school psychologist, right? But then also that there's a peer buddy who's with them throughout the day, who supports and who says, hey, who encourages, who allows them to, ask questions and allows them to kind of navigate the school day. Or the peer could be the interventionist, could be the mentor that they meet with as well. Thinking about the rewards that they choose. Do we go with tangible rewards? Do we go with more time-based rewards? Do we allow them to get out of homework as a reward, right? There's lots of different things that we can do, activities and those types of things, to really make it a personalized intervention in terms of check in, check out. Again, thinking about teacher praise, right, and self-monitoring for teachers. So you can use what's called a motivator, or like a little device that will ping a teacher every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes or whatever you'd like, to provide some praise or some support for the student we're working with, right? So again, we could see that a student is doing really well when they're getting lots of attention and lots of praise. And so we could add that to our intervention. So throughout the day, we could add something on the teacher, and that the teacher is making sure they're checking every now and again to provide a positive word or encouragement or support for the individual students. Again, thinking about different goals that we could put in place, things about social goals around anxiety and mood goals, around how they're interacting with other people, whether they're in seat or out of seat, right? We can really think about any types of behaviors that we want to put in place to be what we're monitoring on that direct behavior rating form. So let's just go with the chat. I think that will probably work better than the poll everywhere piece. If we could put in the chat, and I believe it's been changed so that we can all see each other's responses now. Have we seen check and check out being used in your schools? And if so, what's working or what's not working? If anyone wants to raise your hand to unmute and talk as well, I'd love that as well. So if anyone wants to share with us, that would be great. I'm hearing we need more training to implement it. Absolutely, understood. Finding teachers willing to do it. Yes. So Mary, I'm gonna offer up peers as an option to do it instead of teachers. So you could have either an older peer or same age peer be the interventionist there, be the mentor for it. So we'll talk a bit more about that. That as an option for us. Good. Yes, kids thrive with mentor relationships. That's awesome. Cool. Yes. So I'm seeing that it's being used, but we're not changing it based on our data, right? So really thinking about the consistency of how we're using it. So kids lose their rating during the day. Absolutely. Definitely a concern there. One option would be to make it a virtual one, to make it a Excel file or a shared drive file or something that folks are doing. Now that causes a different issue of how do we remind the teacher to fill it out, right? That's always a thing we kind of have to navigate there. All right, building our tier 2 supports there. Some folks haven't used it. Okay. Cool. Not individualized. Yes. So that would be great to really think about individualizing it for individual students. Cool. Awesome. Awesome. Yes. I'm seeing there's some folks are saying used but not to the full extent, right? So, and then some folks are saying that there's more kind of negative stuff shared than positive. One thing that you could do, for example, is on the form you could include a strength section or a positive section, right? So even if the student didn't earn, they earned 4 out of 20 points, but that there is a section where the teacher or staff has to say what went well that day, what positive things happen that day, right? So it could be it's something we could add to our form to make it more appropriate and more positive for everyone. Awesome. All right, thank you all so much for sharing. If anyone has resources, I have some toward the end of the presentation here, but if anyone has resources or things that you'd love to share, I'd love to share it in the chat. That would be awesome. All right. Okay, so let's do a quick break. If we could be back at, let's do 13 minutes. If we could be back at 1:55 Eastern. So 5 minutes before 2 o'clock. Does that work for folks? Yes. All right. Thank you all. Let's be back in 12 minutes or so. Alright. Yeah, keep sharing as you're as we're coming back. That's awesome. Lots of folks inspired. That's awesome. Couple things that I was looking through some of the comments around check in, check out. Definitely some folks saying that it's kind of being overused, that every student doesn't need it. And that's absolutely true. I think it's a really great structure again to think about how we can intervene. But we really, like with everything, really need to be thinking about how do we individualize it, and is this the right support for this student specifically? So really important to be thinking about things in that way. I also saw quite a bit around how to make this more feasible in the school environment, how to make it more feasible for whoever's managing the data and kind of managing who the mentors are, making sure that it's happening each day. And so I would just think about ways to make that the most efficient process as possible. So again, is there a kind of online form is there a survey, for example, that the teacher could fill out with the numbers in there already, so that the teacher fills it out on their phone, right, and completes it. And so now the data already exists in Qualtrics or in some kind of survey system, so that you don't have to then fill it in and do kind of the data entry piece. Is there some way for maybe in high school, at the high school level or middle school level, for the students to input their scores, right? So does maybe during the checkout process, if we're dealing with older students during the checkout process, the student has to type in the score that they got, whether they got their award or whatever, right? So are there ways to think about making it most efficient and allowing folks to be able to input those data without, the counselor or the school psych or the person who's kind of managing it to have to do all of those pieces? So something like that. Yeah, folks are saying Google Forms, PBIS apps, absolutely. So thinking about using technology kind of to allow us to be more efficient in how we're managing it, right? So the important piece here is that this should not be the responsibility of one person, right? I think many of us experience that in schools, where if there's some PBIS thing, related thing, or some student success thing, it's like it's the counselor, or it's the school psych, or it's the support staff, whatever your role is in the building. And so it's important that this is kind of a shared responsibility, that we're thinking about not just one person being the keeper of all these data, but really thinking about how we can institutionalize some things to make sure that everybody's a part of that process. So awesome, awesome. If anyone has questions related to check and check out, or any of the interventions that we'll be talking about today, please throw them in the chat, and we can, between myself and the patent folks here, we can make sure those questions get answered. I do want to note as well, for the end, I have really just kind of an open Q&A kind of troubleshooting time for us. So we'll have quite a bit of time for us to ask any questions that you're kind of struggling with in terms of intervention implementation, whether it's about these interventions or others, questions that you have about intervention broadly, so we can kind of use this space and use this time together to really help each other out in terms of answering some questions. So that will be available for us toward the end there. All right. All right, moving on to self-management interventions. So self-management interventions there are quite a few different types of self-management interventions, and they're really all about teaching individuals to manage their own behavior, manage their own, observe their own behavior, manage their own rewards, and really thinking about kind of building their own kind of accountability around their own behaviors. And so there's one big piece of it is that if we're thinking about those issues of kind of self-determination, especially for students with disabilities, that kind of self-management is often a goal of our intervention. We don't want students to just, sit in their seat more. We want them to be able to know when they're following the agreements and the rules and when they're not. We want them to be able to manage that themselves and really kind of, keep themselves in check when they need to, really think about, am I following rules? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing right now? And so this kind of group of interventions, and I would argue intervention components that we can add into others, is really kind of the different ways that we can, again, involve students to have some more agency in their own intervention and manage what's going on within themselves. And so again, that the idea of self-determination is often a part when we think about autism and developmental disabilities, that we're oftentimes thinking about how we can allow students to build kind of self-advocacy skills, how we can encourage them to really kind of monitor how they're doing, how they're regulating, what's going on within themselves, and then how they navigate the environments that they're working in. And so these can be really cool interventions and intervention components that we can put in place to support students. Managing how you're doing, your interactions, managing your engagement, like how tired you are, how much you're paying attention in class, or maybe during this presentation, right? All important skills that we've all kind of worked on and learned throughout our time in school and in life. And so these are kind of some interventions that can really train and teach students how to manage that for themselves. So there are lots of different components to self-management. One of them is really as simple as allowing the students, again, to select the behavior that they're focusing on. So we could talk to a student and say, hey, what is your biggest concern in terms of how you're engaging in the classroom, right? Many of the questions that we ask teachers, and we might ask families, we might ask parents, we very rarely ask students, right? What do you want to get better at? And how can we support you in doing that, right? So allowing them to select the target behavior, allowing them to select rewards. So we've done that for a while, where we might have a menu of rewards, and we might say, here are the different things you can work for. What would you be interested in working for? Lots of different opportunities that we can put in place. We could allow that to be random. We could allow them to select. We always want to make sure that those rewards are appropriate in the school, that the staff are okay with it, that families are okay with it as well, but we can allow them to kind of select those rewards. A huge piece as well is goal setting. So let's, going back to our check in, check out, right? We said our goal might be 15 out of 20 points, but the question is, who sets that goal? Does the student set that goal, or do teachers or other school staff set that goal? One example, I implemented check in, check out quite a bit, of course, with students and with peers, and they often would set their own goal as higher than what we were doing from a research perspective. So their goal might be 15, but they said, no, I'm going to get 18, or I'm going to get 20 today, right? So allowing them to have some agency in selecting their goals. There is self-monitoring. So the idea of self-observation and recording. So I'll show you on the next slide, there's some really cool examples. Pinterest has a bunch. There's Intervention Central that has a bunch of options for you, lots of other PBIS apps and all the other resources that have lots of cool ways to put this in place. But what it would look like, so the full kind of self-monitoring excuse me, a full self-monitoring intervention would look like having a student having a form that's on their desk, and they may have a little motivator, a little kind of a beeper that might be on their belt that would buzz or vibrate every 8 minutes, let's say. And so on that schedule, whenever they get a vibrate thing, they would record whether they're on task or not. So that's a really simple way to do it, whether they're on task or not. And then they go through, and they may have a goal for how many they need to have at the end of the session. Oftentimes, there is the adult piece of it as well. So a kid can't just say, yep, I was on task the whole time. The teacher would be like, no, you weren't, right? So really thinking about making sure that they're being truthful in their responses and being accurate in whether they were on task or not. So the student is recording and monitoring whether they're on task or not whenever they're being prompted. And then they could graph that out. They could look at their goals each day and graph out what their goals look like, and see that their goals are improving or not improving, and kind of have conversations around that. There could also be evaluation, where they're looking at, okay, I set my goal for 15 out of 20 points. It looks like I wasn't at 15 out of 20 points. How do I make sure I'm at 15 out of 20 points tomorrow, right? Then the last few here are kind of more meta examples of self-monitoring and self-management where you can do self-instruction. So there could be self-talk. So thinking about affirmations, thinking about positive things that they can kind of say to themselves as they're going through the day. So let's say there's, they get their beeper, they're off task, or they say, okay, no, I'm off task. And so I circle off task. But then there might be kind of some self-talk that they say to themselves as they kind of move throughout the day to kind of encourage getting points the next time that the beeper goes off. And then there's strategy instruction, which is more kind of like maybe there's 4 steps of being on task or 4 steps of paying attention during the class or whatever. And so they could have those 4 steps on their form where they're going through the strategy of how to make this thing happen, how to do the behavior that we're focusing on. So that could be a part of the intervention as well. And then finally, there's actually like they could be a part of like getting their own rewards as well, which is interesting. It has to be supervised, right? They can't just have this treasure trove of stuff that they can just pull out anytime. Or really thinking about making sure that they are responsible for getting the reward that they're supposed to get. So oftentimes what we see in intervention in schools is that when we look at fidelity, the piece that is forgotten the most in terms of intervention is the reward part, which is oftentimes the most important part, right? So the student can do really well, and then everybody forgets to do the reward at the end of the day. And so really kind of empowering students to make sure that they get the reward that they're supposed to get when they earn it, right? So again, self-management, lots of different components. These can be done in combination or separately. These could also be done with other interventions or not. So again, thinking about, let's say, check in, check out. We could have check in, check out, and we could have a teacher form, but we could also have a self-monitoring form for them to say how they're doing throughout the day and kind of have that be a part of the intervention. And then they go talk with their mentor about their self-monitoring form and thinking about how that goes. So here's some examples of self-monitoring forms. I have a link here to the Pinterest that I found that has these types of forms on it. There's lots of different other ones, and we can create them. And again, I think, have students make their own, have them decide what graphics are on there, or what it looks like, or what font it's in, and like kind of all those pieces, right? But thinking about like, are they paying attention? Are they following the classroom rules? What is their goal? How many yeses do they need to have? And then everything signed. You could have student, teacher, and the family sign it as well. So again, different ways that we can implement this. Again, these behaviors are completely open to the behaviors that make the most sense for the student. So again, talking to the student, talking with families, talking with teachers to say what behaviors do we want to focus on during this time? What are we having the most trouble with? And then putting those behaviors on there and allowing the students to monitor their own behavior as well. Again, as I shared before, like if you're using the one here on the left, the self-monitoring form, you would have a goal of how many boxes of yes they need to have. So there's 8, they might have to have 6. But you also want to, at the end of the day, when it's time to figure out the goal, we want the teacher to also kind of say, yes, this looks right. So this looks pretty accurate. Yes, I would say about 6 out of 8 times you were on task, right? So what you don't want to see is that the student just says yes immediately for all of them, checks all the boxes and moves on. We really want to see that they're actually implementing the intervention the way that it is intended for them to do. So if we're thinking about implementing these types of interventions, we have to think about students' goals and students' strengths. So I would think about including students in developing this intervention. As you can imagine, as we're kind of seeing in the chat here, this takes quite a bit of training on the part of the student, right? We really have to train and kind of monitor with the student to train them on how to be more aware of their engagement and how to be accurate in their recording of their engagement. So, for example, what you could do is have the student in a kind of testing setting, so have them in their regular classroom and have them monitoring their behavior every 8 minutes, let's say, and then have someone else, a school psych or a practicum student or someone there monitoring their behavior every 8 minutes as well. So at the same time, and filling out the form so that we can look at how the student filled it out versus how their trainer filled it out to make sure that they're filling it out accurately, right? And so we could say, no, well, actually, that first session, you said you were on task, but you really weren't on task, right? And really thinking about training them up to be accurate in how they're measuring their behavior and making sure, again, that they're actually filling it out and not just completing all of the entire form immediately, right? So it might require some training, of course, as well as kind of some ongoing monitoring to just make sure they're not just saying yes for all their behaviors. It's also important that we are selecting behaviors that they know how to do. So we, back in the day, they called these performance deficits and not acquisition deficits. So behaviors, which is, interesting language there, but behaviors that the students know how to do, but aren't doing as often as we want them to. So this is obviously not good for teaching a behavior. This is good for increasing the rate at which a behavior is happening. And so I want to make sure that we're selecting behaviors that they know how to do, but that we want to see them grow in, and or we are teaching that behavior. So we could teach that behavior first. Let's say it's following rules or staying on task or whatever the behavior is, and then allow the self-monitoring to kind of increase the rate of that behavior and how much they're aware of that behavior. Okay. Again, this has to be developmentally appropriate, right? It has to be appropriate for the student. There are some students, for example, who are just not there yet in terms of that responsibility and in terms of monitoring their own engagement. So I wouldn't think about this for most kindergartners, right? That's not really they're not really there yet. They're just kind of navigating the environment, right? But also thinking about even with older students, there are some students where this type of kind of responsibility might really need to be taught and maybe even need to be earned for them to kind of earn this opportunity to really kind of take this into their own hands, right? This could also be a great way for us to kind of facilitate their engagement and their responsibility within the classroom environment. So really thinking about making sure this is developmentally appropriate and that we're training as much as possible to really make sure the students are doing this really well. Including staff checks for accuracy, as I shared before. So not only taking students' word for it, but also thinking about having the adult or having a teacher who kind of checks it to make sure this is accurate and this is pretty representative of what the session actually looked like. Using those external cues, it could be something on their phone if they're allowed to have their phones. It could be the motivator, like the little device that I shared. It could be the clock on the wall. It could be like different things that we could put in place to use these cues to make sure that they're monitoring how often they are engaged in the classroom. We also want to make sure this is not something that would take away from their attention during class. So we want it to be something that's not happening so often that this is all they're thinking about, but that's happening often enough for them to kind of be prompted and monitor it, but not that it would be so disruptive from the classroom environment, from their engagement with instruction, that it would be kind of disruptive. So this may not be the best intervention for those situations as well. I want to again combine with other interventions, thinking about other things that we can put into place in terms of social skills intervention or check and check out or group contingencies or lots of other things that we could put in place to combine this with other interventions. And we could also use this to fade intervention. So if we're thinking about other interventions that we might have in place, we could kind of fade this and allow the student to start monitoring themselves once they're meeting their goals, once we have the teacher monitoring, let's say, and check out. Once they're meeting their goals, we're good to go, things are going really well, we could switch to the student monitoring now, right? So now that it's less work on teacher, and so now teacher doesn't have to monitor all day, the student can self-monitor, and then the teacher says, yes, that looks good, go ahead and meet with your mentor, right? So we could use it to fade interventions and make things less effortful for our teachers and for our staff in the building. All right. Any questions or thoughts around self-monitoring? Looking at the chat here. Yes, folks are talking about how we make sure that it is developmentally appropriate, right? That we think about having students who are able to kind of demonstrate that responsibility. I would say in many cases, it can be really empowering for a student to learn that we would allow them to do that, right? We would allow them to monitor their own behavior. Now, in many cases, students are like, "Oh, that means I'm just going to put yes and get all the rewards," right? We want to make sure that we're training that up and thinking about that as much as possible, and making sure that we're making sure that they're implementing the intervention as we're expecting them to, and as it is supposed to be implemented. But it can be really empowering to have a student really monitor their own behavior, and really kind of be truthful and be honest and accurate about how things are going and what's going on in terms of their engagement in the classroom. So it's something to think about there. But again, I think in many cases it's really great from that fading perspective to kind of switch and take some of the responsibilities from teachers to switch it to students, especially when they're doing well in the intervention, and we can kind of use it from that fading perspective. All righty. Moving on to my favorite topic, peer-mediated intervention. So we'll talk a bit about a variety of different types of interventions that we can use that involve students as the primary interventionists within their interventions. So I co-edited a book with my colleague Renee Hawkins here at UC called Peers as Change Agents, a guide to implementing peer-mediated interventions in schools. And so we published this book. We found that the most recent review of peer-mediated interventions was in 1990, so a very long time ago, when peer-mediated interventions were really discussed broadly. And so we saw that much of the work that was happening within peer-mediated interventions, especially at that time, was in the world of developmental disabilities and autism. So typically developing, I'm not a big fan of that term either, but typically developing peers working with children with autism, right? So thinking about, empowering peers and training peers to work with their friends with autism, right? And so there was a lot in that world. And so we really looked at, between 1990 and now, there's much more work happening across the kind of educational sector, really around using peers as interventionists in interventions within schools. And so we decided to pull together lots of different interventions within this area. And so we kind of divided peer-mediated interventions into 3 areas and really pulled together amazing scholars to write some chapters that are really practical and gives resources and opportunities for folks to implement these interventions and take these things and implement them in their schools and other settings. So why focus on peers? We know that peers are really important in terms of children's development, their social development, their behavioral, and even academic development. That children spend a lot of time in schools with their buddies, with their peers, and that they learn a lot from them. And so we know that peers can influence each other to do quite a few different things, right? So we know about social media stuff, and we know about how much trends happen and how students can really learn from each other, whether positively or negatively. So we really want to use this peer influence for appropriate behavior. So one of the most amazing things that I've experienced, and one of my favorite things to see, is when students really hold each other accountable for their behavior, or when students really encourage each other and really kind of take on that role to say, hey, let's calm down a little bit, or hey, is there something you need? Like, can I support you? Or hey, let's make sure, hey, our goal is to get X number of points today, so let's make sure we stay on task, right? So those types of things, when you can empower students and allow them to support each other and hold each other accountable, it's just the most amazing thing, when it works well and when it's set up appropriately. So it's really awesome. So we want to use students' influence on each other that we know exists and that is working all the time for good and for positive things that are going to allow students to thrive more in their school settings. So lots of different advantages of a variety of different types of peer-mediated interventions. Again, thinking about our resources, there's been a lot in the chat about we don't have enough teachers to implement check and check out. We don't have enough staff. We don't have enough adults, right? And the answer is you have, or one of the answers might be you have an unlimited resource of students within your schools who could really take on this role. Asking a student to be an interventionist and to support their peer, to be a mentor or a peer buddy, it just makes them feel amazing that they would be selected to do that, right? And so a lot of times they will kind of take on this role and do the best they can and really support their buddies in lots of different ways. So thinking about our resources, we have limited resources in schools. Let's use the resources that we have to a better effect. So instead of one adult meeting with one student, we could have that one adult supervising multiple pairs of students who are all meeting with each other, right? Let's say in the cafeteria, and you have different pairs of students meeting with each other. Now we have like a whole like exponential impact, right? Where we have multiple pairs of students meeting rather than a one-on-one, right? So thinking about using our limited resources better within our schools. Thinking about generalization of our skills. So we know as we learn skills and interventions, that the students have to then go do those skills on the playground and in the classroom and in other settings. And so having a peer who is trained to be a support person in that setting for that student can really help to promote that. So learning a social skill and then having a buddy who goes with you on the social skills group or goes with you to the playground from the social skills group and helps you join an ongoing group, right? And helps you play with other kiddos rather than kind of walking around by yourself, right? Having that peer who can promote that generalization of that skill to different settings is really helpful. Increased opportunities to respond is really important, especially on the academic side of things. And so making sure that we're increasing how often students are responding to prompts and things like that. So thinking about academic side of things and making sure that they're responding as much as possible. Increasing our engagement, making sure that as students, especially when they are motivated by peer attention, having a peer implement the intervention can be really helpful in terms of getting them engaged in the intervention and allowing them to be as successful as possible with it. It allows us to build relationships and help to solidify relationships that are happening within the building. Allowing them to have again a peer buddy who they can feel supported by and who they can support as well. And then finally, the kind of cultural relevance of this. So thinking about having a peer who might look like you, who might use the same language you use, who might say things differently that you can really receive and really get. We know that from the modeling literature, for example, that if we're looking at a model and we're supposed to follow the model and do what the model does, the closer the model is to our various identities, the more likely we are to follow that model and do what that model does. So thinking about, kids might get it differently if another student is saying something to them versus an adult, right? And we know generational things and all those pieces. And so really thinking about kind of the cultural relevance of these types of interventions. Jumping into that a little bit more, I wrote a chapter on peer-mediated interventions and why they might be culturally relevant. One of the pieces is that minoritized, racially and ethically minoritized communities often have this communal orientation where they're supporting each other. And it's kind of the rising tide lifts all boats kind of orientation, where we're really about the community, making sure that folks are taken care of and supporting each other. And so this idea of peer mediated interventions can really be consistent with that kind of communal orientation that's oftentimes the case within communities of color within the country. There's the whole world of culturally relevant pedagogy, so Gloria Ladson-Billings and that whole world of culturally relevant pedagogy, where we're thinking about schools as communities of scholars, not just people kind of individually doing their own thing and learning their skills and moving on, but that they are building communities where each other's success matters to them and that they are promoting and really supporting each other in building their skills together rather than as a community rather than as individual students. The peer modeling work in terms of the similarities to the model being really important in terms of how people respond to models. We know in the world of the medical world, as well as psychology and lots of other support services, there's oftentimes among communities of color, there's a preference to work with someone who looks like you. So having your doctor look like you, or your lawyer, or your psychologist, et cetera. And so really kind of extending that to work in schools, whereas students might prefer to work with someone who might look like them, and then thinking about the race and ethnicity of our school psychologists, our teachers, our social work kind of workforce, thinking about making sure that we have peers who students can connect with on that identity perspective, right? Not that they can't connect with other folks, but thinking about having opportunities for them to connect with someone, if that is their preference, to work with someone who looks like them. Finally, thinking about student agency and empowerment, having the mentors be folks who are empowered to support each other and support their peers within the schools. Having students, for example, be empowered to select or nominate. You could ask a student to say, we're going to implement this intervention. We're going to do this, intervention with you. Who are three people, three of your buddies who you would like, who you think, you look up to, and who are engaging in these behaviors that we decided together will be the behaviors that you want to see? Who are three students in your class who are doing that, right? And then going from there to say, hey, teacher, are these would these three students be good role models for this student? And then getting the students on board, getting families on board, and then going from there, right? So allowing students to, again, have that agency and voice in selecting who the peer interventionist might be for them. So within peer-mediated interventions, we kind of broke things into three different types of peer-mediated interventions. There's peer-mediated academic, behavioral, and then peer-mediated group supports, and kind of more system-wide interventions. On the academic side, there's quite a bit of work around peer tutoring, right? So we're all pretty familiar with peer tutoring, where we could put students into groups of 4 or pairs, or small groups where they're working with each other on their academics. We're making sure that they have all the training and all the skills that they need to kind of go through things. We'll have a big folder. They have all the things that they're working on. There could be rewards related to it. It could be kind of a class-wide thing that they're doing, or it could be centers, right? There's lots of different ways that we can implement kind of academic interventions with peers supporting each other. There's peer-assisted learning strategies. There's game-based things. We can do things with technology, do lots of different things where we're having students working with each other on their academics. There's also the writing world, where we have peers who can help revise and help with proofreading and help giving feedback on each other's writing and things like that. So lots of different things within the world of academics. One of the things that we see pretty often is that there's oftentimes this difference, again, between how we view academics and behavior, where there's oftentimes some pushback around peer-mediated behavioral interventions, because oftentimes staff will say, well, it's not appropriate for students to know about each other's behaviors. But we oftentimes, on the academic side of things, very easily have students work with each other on their academics, right? So it's really interesting to kind of navigate that as well. So one of the things I have to share with schools and with teachers is that students know about each other's behaviors already. Students know who has friends and who doesn't. Students know who are able to navigate social situations and who aren't. And so just like they very much know who's doing better at reading and who's not doing so great, right? And so really kind of making sure that as we're thinking about the behavioral side of things and having peers being trained to support each other on the behavioral side, that there might be a bit of pushback that we might need to work through on that side, because we are much more accustomed to students supporting each other on the academic side of things. So when we're implementing peer-mediated academic interventions, and we'll kind of touch on these briefly because we're focusing more on the behavioral side for this presentation, but one of the things you have to think about is this very fancy term called tutor obsolescence, which simply means that they don't have the answer. So if I don't know what 2 times 2 is, how can I help you with a flashcard that says 2 times 2 is 4? If you say 3 or if you say 8, if I don't know the answer, I can't really help you, right? So what you'll see on flashcards very often is that the answer is kind of small and on the back, right? And that allows, even if I don't know the answer, that I can give you the answer, the correct answer, and I can give you the feedback because it's provided for me, right? So thinking about making sure that we're pairing students in the right way so that we're pairing students who might have the skill already with students who don't have the skill, or we can do things in a reciprocal manner where two students who are both learning the skill can learn it together and tutor each other, but we need to make sure that they have the correct answer because we don't want them to be teaching each other and practicing errors, right? We don't want them to be teaching each other the wrong thing. So we want to make sure that as they're working together in these smaller groups, where we may not have eyes on everything that they're doing, that they have the correct answers so that they are teaching each other the positive and appropriate things. Thinking about how naturalistic versus structured does it need to be, thinking about like what are the tasks that we're putting before them and how are we going to make sure that it's structured enough to be successful but not so structured that it's kind of rigid and not fun anymore. We want to make it as fun as possible, but make sure that they're kind of doing the skills that we need them to be practicing. Are we going to have competitive elements? Are we going to have teams working against each other to get through enough questions in the right time? Are we going to have competitive pieces that are happening in terms of the groups? Or are we just going to make it cooperative and everybody's working toward goals together, or the groups are working on their individual goals together, thinking about what the reward structure looks like and how we're rewarding appropriate implementation of the peer tutoring. The tasks and the content have to be appropriate, has to be at the level where the students know these skills and that they're kind of able to teach each other or practice the skills together, and that everybody really needs to be trained really well to get this going. So one of the pieces of peer tutoring and peer assisted learning strategies in this whole world is that they can often take a while and maybe weeks to get set up and really get everybody in the rhythm and implementing well and doing what they need to be doing, because it's a lot of moving parts, right? I certainly think it's worth it. It's really cool. Students are responding a lot more, and when it works really well, it's really a beautiful thing to see. It really can help students, increase their skills really quickly. But it does take some time in terms of training and getting everybody up to speed, getting everybody organized, and knowing what they're supposed to be doing, what roles they're having. Maybe they're switching roles. Kind of all those pieces are really important to consider, and making sure that we're kind of putting it in place in a way that can be most successful in this environment. All right, on the behavioral side of things, we'll spend more time on the behavioral side and kind of the group contingency world. There are lots of different types of interventions, and many of them can be implemented at the tier 2 level. So we have peer management interventions, we have social skills training, we have pivotal response training, which would be a version of social skills training where we're teaching important behaviors like asking for help or remaining in your seat and those types of things that are really important behaviors that allow us to do other things in schools. We could have modeling, so we could have let's say we're going to circle time or we're going to the playground and we have a peer who is identified as the model for the other peer to follow, and you say, okay, do what this other student is doing, and make sure that if they are playing with another group, that you're going to be there with them playing with the other group as well. There's play interventions, especially for our little ones, where we can kind of have students helping each other in terms of sharing and in terms of giving each other resources and ideas and those types of things within the play setting. And then we have restorative justice and conflict resolution interventions, which we'll talk about a bit more. So peer management interventions, so everything we talked about in terms of self-management, most of those things can instead be peer managed. So having a student prompting, monitoring, providing feedback, giving reinforcement and giving rewards to the other peer. So really easy, simple intervention that we've implemented in schools is, instead of, like having the motivator where the student themselves monitor their own behavior, we could have the peer doing that. So again, now thinking about making sure this is a peer who's going to stay on task, who's going to not allow this to distract them so much from what they're doing. But maybe every 10 minutes they have a little buzzer on them and they look over and see if the student is on task or not. They do a thumbs up or a thumbs down, right? Or a thumbs up and a middle thumb, maybe even better from a more positive standpoint, right? And so that could be the intervention. Very simple, very easy. Thumbs up, doing great. Middle, not doing so great. And then we move on, right? Maybe they record that. Maybe there are rewards related to that. But this idea of just having the peer monitor and provide feedback, right? Again, we would need to train the peer to make sure that they're not being negative, that they're not being evaluative or nasty with things, but that they're really kind of being supportive and positive. But that could be just a simple way of having a student monitor. Another example, as we talked about before, is taking check in, check out, and instead of meeting with an adult, meeting with a peer. We've done peer mediated check in, check out with kids as young as kindergartners, where they really kind of take on this role and really kind of serve as the mentors and as the buddies really, really well. And so it's, again, really amazing to have the students really train them. Of course, you have to, train them up and make sure that they have lots of practice in terms of, for example, we would go through, okay, here's, let's say I'm your peer buddy and I got a 15 out of 20 and my goal was 15 out of 20. So I had a great day. What would you say to me, right? How would you respond to that? What would you do? And they practice and you give them feedback and all the things. And then you say, okay, I'm your peer buddy. You're meeting with me. My goal is 15 out of 20 and I got a 12 out of 20. What would you say? How would you respond, right? And making sure that they're still positive, they're still encouraging, they're not saying anything negative, right? And then saying, okay, I'm your peer buddy. My goal is 15 out of 20, and I got a 2 out of 20, right? What would you say then, right? And so giving them that feedback, having multiple sessions for them to really practice how they would respond to things. As we're doing this, of course, with the peer mediated check in, check out, we would always have an adult there to monitor, to support and see what's going on. But really, we need the peers to be really well trained to implement the intervention in a positive way. And we've done the intervention in quite a few different settings, different age groups, cross age, where we had older students working with younger students, students in the same grade, same classroom, where they, you have a student, within your classroom who's the buddy for the other student. And they really can be trained to do it really well. It doesn't take a lot of time to train the students. And once they have it, they really have it and they're really moving forward with it and doing it really well. So really cool way to implement check in, check out in that way. The other piece I want to kind of touch on, and this is a whole world in and of itself, is restorative and conflict resolution intervention. So the idea here is conflict is inevitable in schools. Whenever there are people, there are going to be conflicts, right? Whenever there are folks, sharing the same space, there are going to be some times where things don't go so well. And so we have to have things in place that would allow us to promote a positive culture, as well as to repair relationships when they are harmed or broken in any way. So the idea with restorative justice or restorative and conflict resolution interventions is where we are really focusing on repairing any harm that happens rather than punishing. So this is often a difference in terms of the zero tolerance discipline. So if something happens, if you do any of these behaviors, you are suspended and you're gone and you're kicked out for 3 days and we don't want you here. And then you come back and, we expect things to be different, right? That's our traditional way to approach kind of discipline related things. Whereas this is a different world where we're focused on repairing the harm. We're focused on acknowledging what happened, why it happened, and making some agreements about how things will be different in the future. And so it's not to allow students to avoid accountability for what's going on or even avoid any consequences about what's going on. It's really about allowing a space for people to talk about what happened and discuss how they're going to make some agreements about how to do things differently in the future. So this can be done at tier 1 level in terms of general restorative circles. You could start today with kind of restorative circles about how folks are doing, anything that may have happened the day before, anything we need to discuss, a morning meeting kind of thing, as well as kind of in a one-on-one or small group types of things when things happen that cause harm within the classroom. A couple things I want to share here, and I talked about a couple weeks ago when I was in Pennsylvania. When students are suspended, they come back to the school, and we expect that things are going to be different. That they're suspended from this classroom, they're gone for 3 to 5 days. They come back, and they're supposed to somehow magically do something different, or the situation is supposed to be different. And there is very often no discussion of how we are returning this student back to the classroom, how we are repairing any relationships that may have been harmed by whatever happened, right? Between the teacher and students, between students and each other, between students and other staff, we just move on like nothing ever happened, and we expect something to be different, right? And so I think in the cases of suspension, which I would argue should be happening less in schools, but it's certainly more equitably in schools. But in the case of a suspension happening, we have to think about re-entry back into the classroom and maybe having a restorative session between a teacher and student who are having a rough relationship to say, okay, here's what happened. Here's what we learned from it. Here's what we're going to do moving forward. Here's what the teacher might change in terms of their behavior. Here's what the student might change in terms of their behavior. Here's how we're going to move forward in a more positive and productive way, rather than show back up, eat your breakfast, and let's move on and expect that anything's going to be different. So I think we can really be thinking about this conflict resolution stuff happening between teachers and students. Also, that teachers would need to be held accountable for some of the things that they do as well. So we oftentimes see that even when well-meaning, that teachers can escalate things. Teachers can make things a little bit worse than they may need to be, right? Or teachers may produce some things that whether they mean to or not, right? And so oftentimes the students are the recipients of that, and the students are the ones who get suspended based on some interactions. I've seen interactions where I was like, yeah, that could have gone completely differently if you didn't make it worse, or if you didn't kind of threaten the student to call the police on them, right? All those kind of things. And so the student gets suspended often, which again is oftentimes inequitably applied and not appropriate in general. And then they return to the school, return to the classroom, everything moves on as if nothing happened. So thinking about how we can use these kind of conflict resolution and kind of restorative interventions to really support re-entry to the classroom, and hopefully getting to a place where we're using them to make suspensions less likely and kind of an alternative to this kind of discipline punishing thing, where we're really thinking about what happened, why'd you do it, what harm did you cause, what are you going to do to make it better, what are you going to do differently in the future, having that accountability and some potential consequences, but not you're kicked out of class or kicked out of the classroom or kicked out of the school for 3 to 5 days. So when implementing these peer-mediated behavioral interventions, we need to be thinking about how we're going to select our interventionists. We need to be thinking about confidentiality issues, right? Thinking about who is selected to implement the intervention, thinking about making sure that the student is a positive kind of role model for their peers, and maintains that positivity within how they're implementing. Making sure that we have those when we do peer monitoring and peer evaluation, kind of the thumbs up, thumbs down thing, that there are some limits to that, right? It can't be so often that the student is really not able to really engage with the other peer. Making sure that we're training multiple peers. So especially if we're thinking of kind of one-on-one mentoring, let's say peer mediated check in, check out, one of the ways that it can go wrong or go sideways is if the peer buddy is absent that day, or maybe they're late or whatever, right? So thinking about selecting students who have really good attendance and who are going to be around more often, but also having a backup peer or having a couple students who might be selected to be able to be trained up to be the peer buddy, so that we don't have those issues if somebody's late or out. And then again, the systems-wide support is really needed for restorative justice and conflict resolution type work, because we need everyone in place to have that alternative to discipline. So it's really hard if one person, a dean of students or assistant principal, is trying to suspend the student and somebody else is trying to have a restorative chat. Like, those things don't make sense. They don't work. So really thinking about what is our system's response when these types of things happen, and how do we move forward in that way. Finally, we'll touch pretty briefly on peer-mediated group supports. So there is, school-wide PBIS, of course. There is classroom management stuff like technology, Classroom Dojo, and all those types of things, as well as kind of the group contingency world of interventions that can be implemented in the classroom. Really cool, and the reason why I want to kind of highlight group contingencies is they can really be implemented at Tier 1, and then having additional supports that are added at the Tier 2 level. So important things to think about when we're implementing our group contingencies. So different types of group contingencies. We have independent group contingencies, which is where there is a criteria in place for everyone within the classroom or within this group, but they have their own individual goals. So an example would be a pop quiz, right? Everybody's taking the quiz, but my grade is only dependent on my responses. It's only dependent on how I do on the quiz. It's not dependent on how other people do. And so we can implement group contingencies in the classroom like that. And this could be a really good way to make it more of a Tier 2 thing. So we could say, every student in the class needs to have X number of class dojo points to get some reward, right? We could make it a Tier 2, make it more differentiated if the number of points required may be different for different students, or maybe randomized, or those types of things that we can really think about, how to make it fit best in our environment. There's a dependent group contingency, which many folks are not the biggest fan of, where the reward for the group or the consequence for the group is based on the behavior of individual people or a small group of people. So this would be a way of implementing this group contingency, but everybody's reward is based on one student and how they do in the classroom. And so this can, again, be pretty kind of isolating if it's not done well and not done appropriately and in the right situation. But one example, I've seen a study where they identified the student, for example, let's say super attention maintained behavior, right? They identified that student as the coach for the classroom, right? So again, switching from deficit oriented, they only care about other kids, to they're so attention maintained, let's make them the coach. And so then the classroom was there to support the coach in getting the number of points that they needed for their awards or whatever. And so the behavior of the coach was really what allowed the class to either get their award or not get their award, right? So really cool ways where we can really rethink using a group contingency at the classroom level, at the Tier 2 level, to better support individual students. Obviously not appropriate in every situation, but could be a potential option. We could also make that dependent contingency where the person whose behavior is determined, is allowing the group to win or not, is hidden. So we could only tell the group, for example, if the star student who the teacher is watching allows the students to win. So if they win, yes, your star student was Henry. Congratulations, Henry's a superstar. If you lose, then we're not going to say that the star student was Henry, right? We're going to keep that hidden, and we're going to say, try again tomorrow. Your star student didn't win. So again, we could have our target students. Let's say we have a group of 3 students who we're more concerned about. We could have them be the hidden star student, right? And really give them lots of praise and lots of rewards when they allow the students to win in the classroom, for example. Then finally, we have independent group contingencies, the interdependent, sorry, group contingencies, the most famous of which is called the good behavior game, where we have students split into teams and they're getting points in a positive way. They're getting points for appropriate behaviors with that group, and they're earning rewards for the most points for appropriate behaviors within the groups. There's other types of group contingencies and interdependent group contingencies, such as the mystery motivator, where the entire class is working together to earn a reward, and it's randomized whether when they meet the contingency, it's randomized whether they get the reward or not. We developed an intervention called Behavior Bingo. I was playing bingo with my sister in New Orleans, and I realized like how interested people were in filling up the bingo board. And so I developed this intervention actually while we were playing bingo, and my sister was like, "Stop! We have to actually play. If you miss your bingo balls, you're gonna be really mad." But I kind of developed the intervention that day, where I was thinking about what if students are filling up a bingo board in the classroom based on their behavior, and they're really excited about I-17 showing up, right? So they're getting polls of bingo numbers based on how well they're doing in terms of their behavior. And they have to fill up the bingo board or get a bingo line as a classroom. And so we implemented that intervention and published it. I have it linked later in the slides here where we kind of created that intervention and had really good success in a classroom for kids with emotional behavioral disorders, where they were filling up that bingo line or bingo board based on their behavior, right? So really cool. And there's been some other studies kind of based on that since then. The last one I want to share with you more about is peer reporting interventions. And then we'll kind of get to some of your questions and get some troubleshooting and what's going on in your settings. So peer reporting interventions, you may have heard tootling or positive peer reporting. They're really cool interventions where we are training students to say positive things about each other. So it's the idea of tattling and switching from tattling to tootling. So a positive version of tattling. So training students to actually say good things about each other, which is, it seems kind of corny. And when I learned about this, I was like, this is kind of corny. But every time I've implemented this in schools, kids with emotional behavior disorders, kids of a variety of different settings, like urban, rural, all the places, like kids absolutely love these types of interventions because they're being trained to give each other props or kudos or whatever it's called. So one piece when we're implementing these, I would allow the students to come up with a name for what they want to call it. So in the research, they're called toodles, but some folks may not like that term. So they might be called props or kudos or whatever they want to call it. So with positive peer reporting, the way that would work is it's more of a kind of verbal reporting of positive things. So the first piece is that you would train students on what an appropriate props or kudos or toodles would look like. And what you're training them on is examples and non-examples of a positive statement. That's not about what they look like or what kind of shoes they have on, but something that they did yesterday that really supported someone else, or something that they really appreciate about this person. And so you can even have prompts in there like, I really appreciated when you did blank, right? And so creating that space and creating that time for them to share those positive things. So with positive peer reporting, it's more of a verbal. So there might be, in the beginning of the day, a teacher might say, hey, we're playing our tootling game or kudos game or whatever. At the end of the day, you're going to have time for your kudos. And then at the end of the day, 5-10 minutes, open up the space, any kudos that we have to share today, right? And so students are allowed to say, raise their hand or whatever and say, hey, yes, Maddie, I really appreciate it when Maddie opened the door for me. That was really awesome, right? Those types of things. So again, we're training on positive statements and appropriate positive statements. And as a class, we're filling up some target goal line, some honeycomb, whatever it is, like whatever we're going to do to make it fun and interesting, but we're earning enough points as a group to earn a pizza party or popcorn party or whatever the group reward is, right? For appropriate positive statements. So again, we're not going to earn rewards for negative statements or bullying statements or whatever, right? We're not going to, even if they are positive, but they're not appropriate for this. So if you say, yeah, you have a cool red shirt on, that doesn't fit, right? We were talking about positive things that people did. So as they say them, they're earning those rewards. We're earning them toward a class-wide cookie party or whatever we're doing. Tootling is a similar version to this, but it's more written. So instead of having students just kind of openly share things about each other, you can give them little index cards or little cards and have them write their kudos or their prompts. And it's really good, especially because you can write the prompt on there and have them kind of fill out the rest of it. And so you can have them write their kudos and drop them in the bucket, right? And then at the end of the day, you could read out or have the students read out some of the kudos that were said or some of the prompts that were said. This allows, this is kind of can be a better way if there are any issues around potential bullying or potential negative things that could happen, because as the adult or as a teacher in the classroom, you can really weed out the negative things and not allow those to be read out, right? So they would not get points for it. So they really just kind of get ignored. They get thrown away. You read out the good ones, the positive ones that people had to say about each other, right? And those could also be anonymous and have students who don't necessarily want to publicly and in front of everybody say the good things. They can kind of write them down, whether anonymously or not. And so different ways to do it, whether verbally or written. So the positive peer reporting versus the tootling kind of way of doing things. So important considerations as you're implementing, training them to give those positive reports, what fits, what doesn't fit, what a good kudos or props looks like. Having those class-wide rewards with the posting of how they're doing, whether it's a goal line that's being increased. You can have like the thermometer piece. You can have, again, like a bunch of bees that are going to the honeycomb, and once you fill it up, we get our reward. You could also do this where you have a star student. So you could say at the beginning of the day, we are all looking for positive things about Maddie, right? Maddie is our star student of the day. At the end of the day, we're all going to say positive things about Maddie. And you could let them know that, or you could keep it hidden. And you could, at the end of the day, when you get there, the students don't know who the star student is. And at the end of the day, we say, okay, randomly we selected Maddie, right? And now our star student is Maddie. So what positive things do we have to say about Maddie? What are some great things that Maddie did today? Again, changes the culture and allows students to really be thinking about good things to say about each other rather than this kind of tattling piece. It can be used kind of at this tier 2 level, because if we think about students who don't get a lot of praise from their peers, who don't have as many good kind of peer relationships, who might be working on their social skills, right? Implementing check and check out for social skills or social skills groups or whatever, right? We could then have them be the star student within the tutoring, maybe a little bit more often than other students. And so they're getting this praise and these positive reports from their peers about what they're doing and what's going on there. So we did a meta-analysis. We saw, and a meta-analysis is when you take a bunch of research and put them all together and look at all the stats about how well the intervention is implemented and how effective it is. And we saw an average of a 32% increase in behaviors that we wanted to see and a 62% decrease in behaviors that we didn't want to see when these interventions were implemented. So really cool evidence-based intervention. Again, it may sound a little corny, but students absolutely love it. Like, who doesn't love positive things being said about you, right? And so some things to really just think about within it is making sure that different students are getting discussed. So if you do the star student route, you don't have to, it could be about any student, but if you do the star student route, that we're making sure that different types of students are being the star student, that we're thinking about things from a gender perspective, from a race perspective, thinking about the students who might not get as much as many positive things shared about them and things like that, making sure that they are selected as star student pretty often and that they're experiencing it as equitable. I would lean more toward the tutoring side, especially for our kiddos, who have writing skills. because with the positive peer reporting, it could kind of become this, the popular kids are getting a lot of things said about them, and we're not really getting lots of things said about other students. And so if you go the positive peer reporting route, I would probably go with the hidden star student route, where at the end of the day we say, okay, and now it's Maddie. Let's say positive things about Maddie, right? So we want to just monitor those things to make sure, even within this intervention, that there's kind of equitable praise that's happening around different students happening in the classroom. We can also incorporate technology like Class Dojo. There's really cool recent studies that have come out where, like with Tootling, instead of writing it on a index card, that they put it in Class Dojo, where the kids have a computer where they can type in positive things that other kids did and put their kudos within Class Dojo, and then the kids see it on Class Dojo. So it's like really cool ways that we can kind of incorporate technology to make these interventions happen. So thinking about our group contingencies broadly and recommendations for how we implement them, again, co-creating our behavioral expectations, coming into the classroom and saying, how do we want to make some agreements about how we're going to treat each other in this space? What are the behaviors that we're all going to focus on and work on together? And making that be how we develop our interventions and our behaviors for our interventions. As I shared before with other types of interventions, setting really attainable criteria in the beginning, making sure that we're building up that momentum so that they're experiencing success early on, and then moving forward from there. So building up that behavioral momentum. And then also using preferred rewards for as many people as possible, having maybe a chest of different rewards that they could pick from, because the idea is, if you are implementing an intervention and I don't want to earn what the group is earning, then it may not be the best intervention for me. I may not be as successful in it or as engaged in it because I don't want to earn what the group is working on. Planning for fading is really important. And again, thinking about self-monitoring as a way to fade, but planning for fading so that we're not implementing the good behavior game or positive peer reporting every day in the kind of traditional way that we would do it, that we would think about how do we make it, if it fits into the classroom setting, which it absolutely does, and it works, that's great, but there could be ways to make it less effortful to implement and easier to implement, even easier than they already are, and ways to kind of switch how we're implementing it to make it easier to kind of continue. Planning for sabotage is important, especially with the group contingencies where they're working together as teams. There are situations where students, especially if they are maintained by peer attention, can get a lot more attention by ruining it for their team than they can get by getting the reward, or that's less valuable than all the attention that they would get if they ruined it for their team. So thinking about planning for sabotage, if that's a thing that could happen, and that could be, for example, the student might be on their own group, or the student might again become a coach for their group. There's different ways to think about how do we plan if a student might try to ruin it for their group. So we could change their criteria. We could think about how the groups are structured. We could randomize who's in the groups on a daily or weekly basis, right? There's different things we could think about in terms of how to navigate it if we have those kind of issues that are occurring. And then using technology wisely, right? We know we have Class Dojo, we have other kind of technology solutions that can be really helpful, wanting to make sure that they are used appropriately, used positively, but not in a way that would distract from what's going on in the environment. So really cool if kids can develop their own avatar and really be engaged and really have the opportunity to write positive things about each other and see the thumbs up and the points that they're getting. That's all amazing. But if it kind of distracts from the focus, which is on the academics and all those kind of things, and if it becomes so much of the focus that we're not learning the various other things that we want to learn, then we have to really think about how we want to navigate that. That maybe we might need to lower the focus on the technology piece, or kind of incorporate it more thoughtfully so that it supports kind of the mission of what we're doing in the classroom. Now, I've also linked later on a practical guide to implementing peer-mediated interventions, where we talked about 4 different areas that we really need to think about when we're implementing these types of interventions. The first is, how appropriate is this type of intervention in terms of developmental appropriateness, in terms of cultural appropriateness, thinking about the student skills who we are having as the recipients of the intervention, as well as the interventionist or as the peer partner. Is this thinking about logistics? So an example would be if we're in a setting where we want to, let's say, have 5th graders working with 2nd graders on their reading or on their behavior or whatever. What are the logistical challenges that could come about from that, right? Like if we have lunch that's happening at different times, or we have specials happening at different times, how do we navigate the schedule pieces, right? So in that case, we might want to have a same age peer, a peer in the same group or same grade, be the interventionist for students. But if it works that there's kind of a shared time that would work for students, then we might be able to implement that, or maybe they do it after school or whatever, right? So think about those logistical things. How appropriate is it to implement these types of interventions in a variety of different settings, and do we have the kind of logistical support to make it happen? Selecting peers, I think, is a really important piece. So again, do we allow students to nominate the peers that they want to work with? Always, of course, having teacher and staff input and buy-in around it. So selecting students who teachers and staff really feel like would be good mentors, or could be really trained to be really good mentors, using their judgment to allow us to select really good peers. Thinking about, again, who's going to be there, who's going to be have good attendance, who shows up on time, who's really going to kind of take on this role as a role model in a positive way. Again, using reciprocal peer-mediated work when appropriate as well. So on the academic side, as well as the behavioral side. So again, we do that very often with peer tutoring, where we have 2 students who are both learning the same skill, and they're working with each other with their flashcards, right? But we've also done it on the behavioral side of things. So we've done the peer-mediated check and check out, where instead of the peer meeting with a buddy who's like a role model and who's a peer support system, having 2 peers who are working on the same thing, working on the same social skill, working on similar behaviors, to meet with each other. And so again, thinking again from a resource perspective, we're even more kind of we're having even more of a efficient use of our resources if 2 students who are both working on these skills are working with each other and meeting with each other during the day. And so we've implemented that, and we found that it's been really helpful and really successful when the students share important identities. So for example, I did one study where I had 2 different pairs of students. One pair, I believe they were like 4th or 5th grade. One pair of students were both Black boys, and they were both kind of like the wallflower students who didn't really engage with a lot of peers, just kind of read alone by themselves, at recess, those kind of things. And so when they were paired together, they were both trained separately on how to work with each other. And they're working on their skills around joining groups and hanging out with other kids and social skills kind of things. So when they were paired together, they really hit it off. They really liked each other. It was great. And they really worked well. And so they did those things that I was sharing earlier, like if the student's goal was 15 out of 20, the student would say, because they were trained to say your goal is 15 out of 20, but the student would add some things to it. So the student would be like, okay, your goal is 15 out of 20, but I'm going to get a 20 out of 20 today. That's my goal. So what are you going to do? And then the other student would be like, well, I'm going to get a 22. Like, let's do it, right? And they're encouraging each other to do really well, and they hit it off, and they had great data. The other pair of students was a Black girl, and she was paired with an Asian boy, right? And so they didn't really hit it off very much. They didn't really kind of engage with each other in the way that we wanted to see. And so they improved in their skills, but not at the rate as the other students, and they didn't have that kind of extra kind of support and encouragement and even competition among them. They were just kind of more robotic in it, where they just said your goal is 15, your goal is 15, okay, have a good day, right? And it wasn't that like that, connection that we really wanted to see among those students. And so that may be idiosyncratic to those pairs of students, but really thinking about who we're pairing with each other. If they're working together on those skills, who are we pairing with each other to make sure that's the best pair? And so it doesn't always have to be along racial and gender lines. It doesn't mean that every Black boy is going to work well with another Black boy, but really thinking about those individual pairings and how we put folks together to make sure that reciprocal relationship goes well and that they're both improving in their skills. Thinking about the training that we put in place, we can do lots of modeling. We can have videos that we're modeling with each other. We can model in different languages. We can practice in different languages if needed. We can use visual aids like having a form, having a little card that has the steps for the check-in and the checkout, maybe check-ins on one side, checkouts on the other side. And so they go into that setting, especially if they're younger, they go into their check-in checkout setting and they have their little visual aid to support them. And then having those clear criteria about how many points they need to have each day. And then monitoring, making sure that we are assessing how things are going, we're tracking how they're implementing the intervention and giving feedback. Again, we've done quite a bit in this world around training students. And again, it takes very little time to get students trained up and ready to go to implement these really simple interventions. And they're really great at implementing these interventions as well. They really kind of take on that role of being that leader and really doing it and being responsible and making it happen. And so really tracking their implementation and giving feedback as we would with any teacher or anyone else who was implementing an intervention if the implementation kind of falters. But we haven't seen any issues with that in terms of students being able to implement the interventions really well. One thing I want to ask is that we live in a pretty divided society, right? We have lots of ongoing conflicts happening across the world. What do we think about the use of peer-mediated interventions and having students working with each other? Could we use this as a way to teach students how to work together across differences? How do we use these types of interventions to help our students learn how to support each other and build positive kind of diverse communities? And what things do we need to think about there? So we could share in the chat. While we're doing that, I'll look at some of the chat that's happening ahead of time as I was chatting before to see if there were any questions. But let's think about how we could do that. And I know we're also past the 3 o'clock mark as well. So I'm here until 3:45. We'll have some time for questions as well. But if anyone has to run, definitely make that happen as well. So I'm looking at the chat here, but any thoughts around what do we do about kind of the divided society that we live in, and how can we use these types of interventions to teach students how to work together across different differences? Right, so I'm saying peer-mediated interventions can have structured opportunities for students to learn to be supportive of one another. Awesome, awesome. Reframing narratives to understand people's perspectives. Love that. Creates a space to talk about differences, build leadership. Cool, giving feedback to each other. Finding common goals, absolutely. Student voice and empowerment. Being on the same team builds those connections, absolutely. It's really amazing when, again, as I said earlier, when we have students really holding each other accountable and supporting each other and building relationships that they wouldn't have had before if they didn't have this shared goal that they're working for together, or if they weren't set up to support each other in that way. Yeah, so in terms of preschoolers with 3 to 5 year olds, absolutely, would need to be adapted for that age group. And so I think again, as I shared before, I have done peer mediated interventions, even kind of check and check out stuff with kiddos as young as kindergartners and first graders. But in those preschool settings, I think it's more about kind of the group work and making sure that we're putting things in place that they can understand that are developmentally appropriate. So some examples would be doing things like there's what's called the color wheel, where, and it's used in elementary school as well, but the idea of having different rules or agreements that are associated with different colors. So red color might be the kind of quiet time, the library, those kind of pieces. What are the rules at that setting versus yellow versus green, right? Those types of things. And so having those different uh, expectations that are clear and is associated with the color, and then putting that on the wall, for example, and then having space for, whenever we're switching from red to green time or to yellow time, that students are able to know what types of behaviors are expected in those settings, et cetera. And those could be connected to the rewards that they're getting. So obviously we want to not be as complicated in terms of the rewards. It could be smiley faces and frowny faces that they're earning, and right, those types of things that we make more developmentally appropriate in that area. Absolutely. Yes, the 3-year-old who calls when other kids haven't cleaned up their toys, right? So it's important to kind of switch that to let's call people out when they're doing cool things. Let's be just as encouraged or just as motivated to say positive things about each other. And so the whole point of the peer reporting and tutoring thing is to really motivate students to say those positive things rather than the tattling stuff. So awesome. What yeah, what might be an unsuccessful pairing? I think part of it, if I could go back and definitely do more studies, which is the plan, having students pick the student they want to work with, or at least nominate a couple students, I think would be really helpful. So if you had in this situation, I was working with students who did not have very many peer relationships. They were not disliked in the classroom, but they were just kind of like neutral, where folks were not really engaged with them as much. And so having students who didn't really engage, weren't really talking with their peers, and then just kind of putting them in this awkward setting where they're forced to talk with another student. I think for that pair was just not the best situation because they're already like not really engaging, right? And so sometimes it's really hard because you don't know whether this group is going to work or whether this pair is going to work or not. So sometimes it's trial and error. But I would venture to guess that if I were to ask those students, who would you like to work with instead of pairing them together based on data, we had a bunch of data that we used to put them together. Ask them who they want to work with. That might give them more agency and more kind of engagement with that relationship and that process to allow them to develop that relationship in a better situation. Get buy-in from teachers and families. Love that. Yeah, awesome, awesome. Love the conversation we're having here. So, um, making sure we're thinking about students' backgrounds. Yes, absolutely. Good, good, good. Okay. All right. So really wanted to open the floor now for questions. Any interventions that you're implementing that you're like, I'd really love. This is a community of experts, not just me, but many of us who are here who are implementing these interventions and have resources and ideas. So let's throw some things in the chat, or if anyone wants to, again, raise your hand and you could talk verbally as well. I believe that's available. So if you have questions or things that you want us to work on or think about, I'd love to be able to help as we're doing that, okay? So whether you're throwing it in the chat or raising your hand, I want to orient us to some resources. We'll talk about takeaways later, but I have 2 pages here of resources of links that you can go to get links to lots of different interventions, tier 2 interventions. Their Panorama has a really great check and check out toolkit. It has lots of different examples of different forms you can use for check and check out and how to implement it, how to involve families and all those pieces. There's self-management resources as well as resources for peer-mediated intervention. So I have a link to the book that we did, but also the practical guide that we talked about, the behavior bingo study where the students were filling up the bingo board. That original study is linked here. Lots of resources around restorative justice as well. So really cool resources that are available to you in the slides that you were sent. So, all right, opening up for questions. What questions do you have?
Just helping you keep an eye on the chat. We did have a comment that in Pennsylvania, we have the PA Career Ready Schools, and this whole session has kind of helped folks think about that connection, which is Pennsylvania's alignment to SEL. Then there is a question in the chat. I would love some advice for middle school, specifically tier 1 strategies to address negative and racial comments made to each other. We have systems in place for tier 2.
Yeah, so there are some resources that are available around kind of courageous conversations for students, and there's some things in place to allow, how do we have those conversations around race and around microaggressions and racial issues that can occur within schools. So I think having those restorative circles and restorative chats would be really helpful from a preventative perspective. So talking with students about race, about racism, about kind of these different terms and how these kind of racial epithets can be used to really harm people and what that means, and how we're going to make some agreements around being more respectful of each other. I also think accountability for students who are engaging in these problem behaviors is really important, and it's really important for the students who are the recipients and or who are part of those groups to see that their school values them and that their school will protect them in situations when they are being microaggressed, right? So it's important to, I think, create a culture of positivity and affirming and welcoming everyone and all those kind of pieces in any ways that you can. And again, having that accountability when it doesn't go the way that it should. And again, then how do we repair those issues? We also don't want to have, we see on Instagram and Twitter all the time the kind of cancel culture thing, right? A student or a person does something wrong or it says something wrong, and then they are like immediately canceled and they, lose their job and lose everything, and they have to kind of go away for a while and hope that they can kind of re-enter the public sphere, right? We want to, of course, not allow for these negative things to be happening all the time, but also allow space for folks to learn and grow and make some mistakes in some situations, right? Obviously not harmful, negative, hurtful, disrespectful mistakes, right? But allow for a space for allowing people grace when they haven't had these experiences and they're still young and haven't, learned. I think we all make these kind of mistakes all the time where we might misgender someone or use the wrong term or not, unintentionally kind of offend people with some of the things that we say. even those of us who do social justice work and who, think about these things and read about these things, right? None of us are perfect. And so creating space for folks to learn and grow in a way that doesn't harm people, and also creating a culture of positivity and affirming and respect within the building. So hopefully that helps and kind of helps with that question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just scanning the chat to see if we have any other additional questions or things that folks are wondering. I'll see a couple things in here. We have those. Some resources. Okay, that's just some suggestions. Thank you. Thank you, Courtney. Just looking for any other kind of final questions here. I will share that I love the peer-mediated interventions. It's something that we often don't use enough in education, and there's great research to support their efficacy. We do some of that in math, we do a little of that in reading as well, kind of expanding our horizons and ability to use peers in providing targeted interventions with sufficient training, support, using those interventions in the way that they're intended to be, used, and that get good results. Okay, just checking.
Yes, absolutely. I saw something a bit earlier about rewards for middle school students, and I think what was shared in the chat is absolutely perfect. So asking the students what they would be motivated by. Of course, we have to think about obviously what budget we have and what's possible, and allowing staff to also kind of weigh in on those things, but also thinking about things that don't cost us any money, right? So I love that folks brought up, the idea of a free pass to a school event that's already happening that wouldn't really cost too much. You could think about activities that they have. You can think about time that they could get. Some kids would do anything just to be able to listen to their music on their phone for a little bit, right? Some kids would, do anything to have just some time by themselves or some time with their peers. So, all the activities or all the rewards don't have to be, physical things that you're buying. It doesn't have to be, Gatorade or, candy and all those kind of things. You can really think about some time-based stuff that could be free, that could be limited resources. Think about homework passes that, folks would love to work for. I think we would all love to, work for the ability for somebody to check our email for one day, right? Those types of things. Like there could be things that don't involve money that we could ask and that we could put in place for our students. VIP section at an event, absolutely. So that's great idea, Courtney, where again doesn't cost any money, but maybe they're in the front row at the prep rally, right? Like those types of things that they could earn that we could just think creatively about.
Okay. Any other final thoughts or questions? We appreciate this has been a very active chat. Tons of questions, tons of interaction. We just want to thank everybody for their participation today.